The riffs are too repetitive, the lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides and the cover art's a mess. There's so much here to tear apart. Listen to it for a week, now that week has passed. It's Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Why I Hate This Album. I am one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey. Not with me, as always, co-host extraordinaire, Timothy Richardson. Don't worry, folks, Tim's fine. He's just off doing Tim-type things. Rather than leave you guys high and dry, I put together a solo cast. It's going to be another in my band Breakups and Bitter Feuds series. This is where we focus on where it all goes south. So, hit bands, where their feuds came from, why they hate each other, and in some cases, why they ended up breaking up. But this week is a little bit different. As you guys might know, typically I tell two stories, focus on two different bands or rivalries, but this week I wanted to do Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, John Lennon, Paul McCartney. Turns out there's a lot of information about both of those bands. And so as I was putting together my Mick and Keith notes, I realized they just kept getting longer and longer and longer to the point where it's almost the length of a normal solo cast. So I had to make the decision. Do I cut it off just with Mick and Keith and release it even though it's going to be a little shorter than normal, or do I hold off, wait till I have the John Lennon, Paul McCartney piece and release it all as one? I figure a slightly shorter episode is better than no episode at all, so here it is. In case this is your first time listening to the band Breakups and Bitter Feuds series, let me break it down for you. This is by no means a classic solo cast. I'm not giving you the full biography of the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger, or Keith Richards. That's for another day. However, what we are going to focus on is where it all went south. It is renowned that Mick and Keith kind of hate each other, which is fascinating because they're in a band that's been around for 60 years. So I got to thinking, what exactly caused this? How did they manage to stay together? So over the course of the next, probably 40-ish minutes, maybe 30, we're going to break it down. Now, if you don't know much about the Rolling Stones, don't worry. I'm going to give you just enough so that you kind of understand who this band is in history and how they came to be. Then we're going to get into probably around 1968, where it all starts to go sideways. And from that moment on until now, we're going to outline where Keith and Mick just butted heads, all out fought, and the multiple times they almost broke up. As I said up top, Tim will be back next week. If you did tune in this week, here's a special treat. I think we're doing Harvey Danger Flagpole Sitta, so get your MP3 players out, get to doing your homework for next week. Thanks for listening. But until then, it's time to get into this week's episode. So I give you Band Breakups and Bitter Feuds, Part 3, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. In 1950, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger became classmates and subsequently friends in Dartford, Kent, England. Sometime later, the Jaggers ended up moving a bit down the road, and in 1954, Mick started an informal garage band with his new buddy, Dick Taylor. Their catalog mostly consisted of cover songs of their heroes like Muddy Waters, Little Richard, and Chuck Berry. It was actually while holding records of those very artists that Mick next ran into Keith again on a train platform in October of 1961. Keith quickly noticed the albums, and within weeks, he was meeting up with Dick and Mick, it's the first time I noticed that, to begin playing music together. They rounded up a few more folks, and in late 1961, the first real band with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards was formed. They called themselves the Blues Boys. Not a great name, but it was 1961 and they were 17, so, cut them some slack. The Blues Boys were short-lived, and the band was quickly absorbed into something called Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated. That lasted about a half a year, but was incredibly helpful for introducing the Glimmer Twins to the rest of what would officially become the Rolling Stones, consisting of drummer Tony Chapman, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Brian Jones, keyboardist Ian Stewart, and Dick Taylor. Jones named the band when he was asked during an interview for Jazz News what the new band was called. Scrambling for an answer, he happened to be staring at a Muddy Waters LP and a song called Rollin' Stone. He blurted it out and history was made. There were a few more lineup changes, and the final classic Rolling Stones lineup with Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman played together for the first time in public on Saturday, January 12th, 1963 at the Ealing Jazz Club. In 1964, after passing on the Beatles, Decca Records gave the Stones an incredibly favorable record contract with terms that were unheard of at the time. But it paid off. In 4 short years, the Rolling Stones would release between 6 and 8 albums, depending on how you count, each more popular than the last, with the exception of their Satanic Majesty's Request. That album is pretentious, drug-laden, and just a poor attempt to outdo Sgt. Pepper's. Don't go listen to it, or do if you've never heard it. It's just bad. Despite that misstep, the Rolling Rolling Stones in a very short period went from a standout of the British blues boom of the mid-60s to the bad boys of rock and roll and world-famous stars. They were the anti-establishment, anti-pop, anti-Beatles, anti-everything band. As is often the case, the more famous they became, the more stories of drugs and women made their way out to the pages of tabloids and a magazine in its infancy that happened to bear the same name. Mick's stories tended to be more about him charming beautiful women and groupies, while Keith's stories hinted at drug use and just general debauchery. The truth was, they were all partying pretty damn hard. They were the Rolling Stones in 1967. They were literally having the time of their lives. But, as all good things do, the fun was about to come to an end. In February of 1967, police raided the Sussex apartment of Keith Richards, where they uncovered his personal stash of LSD, heroin, and marijuana, which would not be that big of a deal in 2023, but in 1967 it was tantamount to murdering people. Weirdly, the British police were working on a tip from the FBI delivered by MI5. The FBI were tipped off about the drugs by David the Acid King Snyderman. Although even in 1967 it shouldn't have been hard to guess that the Rolling Stones might like to partake. On the evening in question, Keith was having some folks over when the police arrived and both Mick Jagger and Richards were convicted, with Mick sentenced to 3 months and Richards to an entire year in prison. Lucky for the Glimmer Twins, and yes, that is a real nickname that they gave themselves, public sentiment turned in their favor, and after an appeal, their sentence was reduced to a paltry 3 days each. If anything, it only helped to serve their reputation as the bad boys of rock. This was probably the closest the two would ever be again. While Keith was just starting his very long journey with hard drugs and, frankly, even harder living, you could say that Mick was scared straight by the whole experience. Keith thought it was rock and roll that the Bobbies raided his mansion for partying. Mick thought it unbecoming of his new status, and he would not be tempting fate like that again. That's not to say that Mick exactly kept his nose clean. The guy still partied as hard as somebody who's the frontman of the Rolling Stones should in the late 60s, but he became a lot more mindful of the company he kept and how he conducted himself in public. Contrasting his bandmate, and despite his legal troubles, Keith continued to use heroin, and beginning on one particular night in 1968, he began to escalate his use. The reason for the excess? Well, at least one reason, was that a mere 3 miles away from Richard's house in Lowndes Square, his girlfriend Anita Pallenberg was seducing his bandmate, and at this point still best friend, Mick Jagger, in front of an entire room of people. They were filming the 1970s movie Performance, which is a British crime drama most people have not seen, and frankly, you don't need to. The film had struggled to find distribution due to its, quote, strong sexual content and graphic violence, so Warner Brothers shelved it for 18 months and then dumped it on Christmas Day 1970. Now that might sound confusing to a 2023 audience, but guys, you have to understand, Christmas used to be one of the least popular times to go to the movies. It was amazing. I went every year growing up. There would be no one there, and then suddenly news got out and it went from nobody to packed. Anyway, now you see, it's sort of ironic that Richards was concerned that Anita was cheating on him with Mick, which, I mean, come on, they almost certainly were. They're in a movie together where they have several sex scenes, and it's Mick Jagger. They're probably banging, but still ironic because earlier that year, Richards had gone on vacation with bandmate Brian Jones and Anita, his current girlfriend, and when they left, Anita was Brian's girlfriend, but when Brian got violent in Morocco, she and Keith left, and when they got back home, she just moved into his house. So while it's not exactly the same thing, you can see why he might be concerned. Anyway, during the filming of the entire movie, Keith stayed extra high on heroin, worried that Mick's charms would be impossible to resist and a sexually charged script would lead to Anita cheating on him. And to help him ignore the very likely odds that they were in fact banging, he sought comfort in the one place he had always found it, his guitar. In his very high, grief-stricken state, Keith actually began writing what would become the opening to the song Gimme Shelter. It helped to take his mind off the idea that Mick and Anita were almost certainly having weird 60s sex and laughing at how silly Keith is sitting home alone just miles away. Now, did anything actually happen between the two, you might be wondering? There's no official word on the matter, but depending on who you ask and when, you get a slightly different answer. In Keith's biography, he says they definitely had to have slept together. He also says that Jagger has a small wiener, so he might just be petty. Richards also claims that afterwards he sought revenge by sleeping with Jagger's girlfriend Marianne Faithfull, an act so heinous in Mick's opinion that that Keith had to apologize to his face in 2011 or Mick would quit the band. He was 70, so go ahead. Anyway, when Jagger was asked about it, he said, quote, "All the stories around the filming of those scenes are so good, I'm not even going to deny any of them," end quote. And given the fact that Mick had a bit of a "if I can seduce your lady, then is she really your lady" attitude about significant others, I would say the smart money is on yes, they almost certainly did have sex. And apparently, Keith came to a very similar conclusion. This was the very first moment where a sense of betrayal and suspicion started to undermine Keith and Mick's relationship, and it started to drive a very subtle wedge between the two. In interviews, Keith claimed that it actually caused Mick's behavior to slowly change, pulling away from Keith and, in Keith's opinion, confirming his suspicions. I find that hard to believe. I think Keith probably started acting differently and doing a lot more heroin around Mick, and that's probably why Mick started pulling away. But, I wasn't there. Minor relationship strains aside, the band was about to embark on the most successful string of their entire career. Between 1969 and 1972, the Rolling Stones would release Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main Street, cementing them as one of the greatest rock bands of all time. However, the recording and success of those albums, and Keith's suspicion that Mick might have fucked his special lady, all planted the seeds for a feud that would literally run as long as the existence of the band itself. Probably not coincidentally, during the 70s, the quality of the Rolling Stones albums began to become a lot less consistent, and if you ask me, mostly just not nearly as good. That's not to say there aren't some great songs in the mid to late 70s Rolling Stones albums, but coming off of their stretch from the late 60s to the early 70s, it's a clear decline in output. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. As the Stones were ascending the throne of British rock gods, Keith was happy to embody the rock and roll ethos, while Mick preferred to use his new money and status to make his way into London high society. Even as early as 1971, Jagger had married Bianca Perez Mora Macias, not sure about that, a Nicaraguan actress and budding socialite that would help him to shed his street-tough rock and roll reputation. Keith, of course, hated her from the start and everything she represented about how Mick was changing. In reality, she was just a really beautiful woman, and he was Mick Jagger. It's not rocket science. No wonder they got married. But Keith almost saw it as an affront to him, and the distance between them began to widen. Even as early as Exile on Main Street, the animosity and perceived change in priorities began to bleed into the recording sessions. During these sessions that lasted over a year and across 3 geographies, all of the band members had competing priorities and contradicting opinions. Not to mention people like William S. Burroughs, Graham Parsons, and John Lennon were all stopping by to quote-unquote hang out and distract the band. Also, to do a lot of drugs. Mostly with Keith Richards. The bulk of the recording did take place at Keith's French home, allowing him to stay up to his ears in heroin and giving the rest of the band the creeps. At one point, the French police stopped by and asked Keith if he wouldn't mind reducing the number of incredibly famous people on drugs that just seemed to be hanging around that small town. Keith was happy to oblige and asked his very famous friends to leave. If all of this sounds incredibly chaotic, it was, and it had a very strange end result. If you go look at the credits for that album, all sorts of people are playing different instruments or multiple instruments on the song. The reason was that they simply couldn't find the band member who was supposed to be playing it. Or the not totally uncommon, "Oh, did we forget to tell you we were recording today, Bill Wyman? Sorry, no worries, we just did your part for you." The other problem was that when you have the band working at different times with different people, you started to see additional tracks and instrumentation being added to songs. It was a wonder that producer Jimmy Miller was able to create the album he did, although even the band would admit what he had to work with was not their best takes. Despite themselves, the band released Exile in May of 1972 in the US and went back out on tour, both being wildly successful. This time on tour, things were a little bit different. By this point, Mick was requesting his own dressing room so that he could sidestep some of the pre-show rituals, such as getting really high and doing shots. Which I completely understand, but nothing builds a wall between you and your bandmates quite like a physical wall between you and your bandmates. The message was already clear. Mick was tired of the nonsense. Don't get me wrong, Mick Jagger parties, let's all be clear about that. But he wasn't a junkie, and it takes a certain mindset and energy to go out there and be Mick Jagger. He couldn't be drunk or high all the time and do that successfully. The tour ended, and the band took a very small break before beginning work on their next album, Goat's Head Soup. Unfortunately, in 1973, Keith and Anita's apartment was raided again, and they were arrested and charged with possession of marijuana, cannabis resin, Chinese heroin, Mandrax tablets, burnt spoons, syringes, pipes, a loaded handgun, rifle, and the 110 rounds of ammunition. Keith claimed he had a tenant living at the apartment, and that person was the owner of all of those highly illegal things that he has often been known to use and have and generally be around. It's basically the "I'm just holding it for a friend" defense, and wouldn't you know it, it totally worked! And the two got off with any real serious consequences. The Stones continued their recording and touring schedule, releasing 2 more albums. Following the tour in support of It's Only Rock and Roll, guitarist Mick Taylor announced that he was leaving the band. Some say he and Keith couldn't get along, others say Mick had a big ego and a drug problem all his own, but in either event, he left and was replaced by Ronnie Wood, who definitely had a drug problem, but was a lot easier to get along with in the studio, so they let it slide. The disruptions continued in July of 1975 when Keith and Ronnie were driving to a concert in Dallas and were pulled over for erratic driving in Feuds, Arkansas, which frankly, I don't want to be pulled over in Feuds, Arkansas, so I gotta imagine they were pretty fucking scared. Somehow, Keith passed a sobriety test, but there was another problem. The car smelled like weed, so the officer began a searching. He quickly found 2 grams of cocaine that coincidentally were claimed by their passenger, noted not Rolling Stone member Fred Sessler. Fun side note on Freddie Sessler. It actually probably was his cocaine, sort of. Sessler was the go-to bagman for all the Stones' cocaine needs. He dabbled in other pharmaceuticals, but claims never heroin. I don't believe that for a minute. He also swears that he wasn't a dealer and never took a dime for the insane amounts of cocaine he supplied the band with. And I do mean an insane amount of cocaine. He also supplied the band with a harem of groupies each tour, which likely came with having a seemingly endless amount of cocaine. Easy to make friends when that's your party trick. Anyway, back to 1975 Fordyce, Arkansas. The cop, angry he hadn't found what he was looking for, ended up arresting Keith for, get this, the possession of an illegal hunting knife, which is still way better than possession of cocaine or marijuana in Arkansas in the 70s. Hell, I think both of those are probably still pretty bad in the 2020s. Still not scared straight and clearly a target of the Canadian government, Keith was arrested again in 1977. While in Toronto, his hotel room was raided by police and a large quantity of heroin was found. He was charged with possession of heroin for the purpose of trafficking, which is exactly as bad as it sounds. I don't know exactly how the police ended up in Richard's hotel room with the heroin. I did read a lot about informants at the time, so it may have been a tip-off, but I suspect they just went in there knowing he clearly was a heroin addict and you're going to find heroin if you go in that room. Now, as you can imagine, all of these distractions, aka serious international criminal charges, plus the fact that Keith was in fact a very heavy daily heroin user, should have made keeping the Rolling Stones together literally impossible. However, while Keith remained in his drug-addled haze, Mick took the reins and managed to transform the band into a multi-million-dollar industry. Also shocking, the band kept making albums and touring. But imagine trying to get a visa and planning a tour for somebody who has multiple arrests for heroin possession in multiple countries and other drugs in the 70s. It had to have been next to impossible. I don't know how in the world anybody was ever able to insure this band, let alone get Keith Richards into the country. It's shocking. Now, there's also the fact that every time this happens, he's letting his bandmates down. Not to mention, have you ever tried having a conversation with somebody actively on heroin? It's pretty tricky, let alone getting them to write new songs. Publicly, Jagger was really solid about it. He didn't talk shit about Keith in the press at all. Privately, he began to despise him, passive-aggressively at first, and then kind of aggressively. Having taken his fair share of drugs himself, Mick thought Keith was just weak for not being able to put down the H and get back to work. But I suspect Mick was both not an addict and not doing delicious heroin. So it's not exactly an apples-to-apples comparison. He didn't understand that Keith Richards was deeply addicted to heroin, and he couldn't stop. So he thought he was weak, and he would antagonize him, and rightly so. It had to have been maddening to try to write an album with somebody that used to be a great collaborator, and now was just high on H. Years later, Jagger did speak about Keith's use and its impact on the band, or at least him, saying, quote, "It was very difficult to work. He still was creative, but it took a very long time. Anyone taking heroin is thinking about taking heroin more than they're thinking about anything else. That's the general rule about most drugs. People have different personalities when they're drunk or take heroin or whatever drug. I don't find it it easy dealing with people who have drug problems. End quote. Even when he's being pretty damn specific, he still had the class to not say Richard's name. Why, I have no idea. As we're gonna see, Keith did not have the same courtesy. Keith's addiction and the band's patience with him all came to a head after that 1977 arrest. If convicted, Keith faced anything from 7 years to life in prison. They were charging him with trafficking. He was held in the country until April before being released on medical grounds to go treat that heroin addiction. While getting clean and worrying about his impending court date, the band still managed to record and release Some Girls in 1978, which became their best-selling album and is among the best post-exile albums in my opinion. How they did this, I have no idea. I can barely focus if I haven't paid my bills. This guy was possibly going to jail for life. I guess that's why he's in the Rolling Stones and I do this. Anyway, miraculously, Keith's charges were reduced to possession after a blind woman provided character witness testimony, stating that he made special arrangements for her to be able to attend Rolling Stones concerts. Richard pleaded guilty, of course. He was granted a suspended sentence and ordered to play a benefit concert for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. So grateful, I believe he played too. But more importantly, all this actually got him to quit doing heroin, which is shocking, and I think not widely known. I think most people assume because of his general appearance that he did it much longer. He just did it that hard. While this should have been great news for the band, it actually created a new problem. As Keith retreated into his addiction, Mick became the decision maker for the band. No longer high out of his mind, Richards wasn't going to blithely go along with whatever Mick wanted to do. And coincidentally, Mick was beginning to have a lot more opinions than he used to. The end result was them largely ignoring each other. They didn't fight so much as just passive-aggressively ignore what the other one was trying to do or say. I also think that Mick might have been slightly scared of Keith, and with good reason. Having read his biography, this is a man that walks around with a gun and whiskey at almost all times and no hesitation to enjoy either. By the time the band was on tour in support of 1980's Emotional Rescue, Keith and Mick had completely stopped talking. On stage, they could be professional, recognizing the skill of the other, but off stage, it was Mick in one room, Keith in the other, never the twain should meet. In the studio, things were even worse. Richards demanded they stick to their R&B roots, while Jagger insisted their sound had to evolve to stay relevant. I honestly don't know who's right in this argument, and based on what they actually put out in the 80s, I think they should have gone with the third option and just stop. But they didn't. Their next album, Tattoo You, was comprised almost entirely of recycled B-sides due to the fact that they had such a heavy touring schedule. At least that's what they told the press. In reality, it's because they refused to come to the studio, at least not at the same time. Keith had taken to calling Mick Her Majesty behind his back for thinking all of his ideas were superior, and Mick was deeply frustrated with Richards' refusal to update their sound from the classic Rolling Stones hits. Despite this, they did cobble it together and release the album in 1981, but even this created controversy. The album was supposed to be called simply Tattoo, but when it was released, the cover said, Tattoo You. Keith believes that Mick had it changed without telling him, and Mick swears he has no idea how that happened. Now, that's not really how records work, even in 1981, so if you ask me, chances are Mick had it changed and didn't want to have the argument with anybody, or at least signed off on the change, and probably shouldn't have. When it was time for new material, the recording sessions for 1983's Undercover were a non-stop tug-of-war between Keith and Mick. Mick wanted to embrace the popular styles of the day, and Keith wanted to play classic Stones rock and blues. Neither side won, and nobody lost more than the listener. This album is a crazy mix of hard rock, reggae, and new wave. Add to that, if you listen to the songs, you can kind of tell these guys are angry and not in a fun way. A lot of the songs are very open references to the arguments they're having on a daily basis. By late 1983, the band needed someone to come in and to help them mend fences and rebuild relationships, a real Dr. Towel. Instead, they got the exact opposite. The Stones' Warner distribution deal had expired, and CBS Records wanted to add the Rolling Stones to their already incredibly impressive roster. Enter label president Walter Yentikoff, one of music's most insane and entertaining figures. I've read this man began each day with a glass of vodka and a cigarello while his barber both dyed his beard and shoveled cocaine up his nose. Now, allegedly, because I don't want to be sued, but I completely believe it and I read it in multiple places. And I gotta say, it worked. He presided over the most profitable and prestigious stable of artists of all time, a roster that simultaneously included Michael Jackson, Bruce Springsteen, and soon, the Rolling Stones. Jagger, for whatever reason, took it upon himself to deal directly with Yetnikoff, and while I'm sure Keith says he would have liked to be included, he didn't actually want to sit there with this lunatic and glad hand him, so it kind of worked out. In late August 1983, the Rolling Stones signed a new deal with CBS for a reported $28 million, an incredible amount of money, especially when you consider the clear downturn in quality by that point. Buried in that $28 million contract was a small provision for Mick to make not just one, but up to 3 solo albums. Yetnikoff believed that Mick was the Rolling Stones and had plans to make him a solo star like Michael Jackson had become after leaving the Jackson 5. Mick claimed Keith was fully aware of the solo album provision in the deal and that he was completely fine with it. Keith disagrees with that accounting. He also didn't hesitate to voice his opinion in the press, stating in an interview, quote, "As far as I'm concerned, if you want to say who broke up the Rolling Stones, I'd say CBS." End quote. And he wasn't entirely wrong. Yetnikoff had Jagger thinking he was a musical genius that could do no wrong, and he was bringing that attitude into the studio with a lot of really big new ideas. Think Rolling Stones meets U2. Yeah, that's what he wanted to do. It would have been gross. Strangely, despite the open hostility between the two that had now been going on for almost a decade straight, when Keith Richards married Patty Henson in 1983, who remains his current wife to this day, Mick Jagger was his best man. So, you tell me. By the end of the undercover sessions, the two worked in shifts at the studio, spending much of their time erasing or reworking whatever the other had been doing the previous day. Despite this Sisyphean cycle, the record somehow got done, and as I mentioned, was not great. Luckily, Mick refused to go out on tour because he had a solo album to go work on that was totally no big deal, and he wasn't planning to leave the band if it works out. This isn't a Beyonce situation at all. But it was. So that's what he went and did. His first solo album, She's the Boss, was released in February of 1985, and despite selling 1 million copies, it did not have the Beyonce effect he was hoping for. Also around this time, Mick recorded that awful Bowie duet of Dancing in the Street, which I'm embarrassed by, so I gotta imagine Keith hates it at least as much as I do. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, Google those words and prepare to be utterly shocked. It is, well, that's the word, shocking. When the band returned to the studio for a new Stones album, it was clear Mick had used all his best ideas for the solo record, which of course pissed off Keith, and in turn that somehow pissed off Mick. The atmosphere was so terrible that Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman refused to show up at all. So Keith and Ronnie wrote a bunch of the songs alone, and the results are as bad as you would expect them to be. Though the songs certainly conveyed a theme with titles like Fight and Had It With You, they were not subtle. Despite these obstacles and pretty much not communicating with each other at all, the Stones gutted it out, and Dirty Work was released in March of 1986. Now, in case there was any confusion about the state of the band at this point, the music video for the single One Hit literally depicts Keith and Mick pretending to fight each other as they circle round and round. Luckily, it didn't come to blows for the band, and I'm not surprised, but allegedly they had to be pulled apart towards the end. After the release of the album, Mick refused to tour again, claiming that the band was not, quote, physically healthy enough, and also he hated Keith and didn't want to see his stupid face. That second part was implied. Instead, Jagger began to work on his next solo album, Primitive Cool, a title I have to say sounds like a really bad AOL screen name, and I love it. The album was released, Jagger put together a world-class band and set out on tour as a solo act. Not to be outdone, Keith formed his own solo-ish act called Expensive Winos, released an album, and he set out on tour. Keith's album was a clear indictment of Mick with lyrics like, "Why do you think you got no friends? You drove them all around the bend." Jagger's album was universally panned, as you might expect, and as the tour continued, the number of Stones songs that appeared on the set list began to increase. Saying in an interview at the time, Richards said, quote, "I thought it very sad that a high percentage of his show was Rolling Stones songs. If you're going to do something on your own, do stuff off the 2 albums you did. Don't pretend you're a solo artist and have 2 chicks prancing around doing tumbling dice. That severely pissed me off. If Her Royal Highness had her way, we'd be playing in fucking panto." I don't know what panto is, so I assume it's an insult. Write in, heypodmail@gmail.com. As I mentioned, while Mick stayed classy in the press, this was just one of many direct quotes from Keith openly criticizing including Mick Jagger, and he has never once responded directly to any of them. I also read that privately, Keith threatened to slit Mick's throat if he didn't stop playing Rolling Stones songs on tour, but allegedly that's just a rumor. Ultimately, even Stones songs couldn't save him, and the US leg of Jagger's tour was canceled due to low ticket sales. Meanwhile, the expensive winos were selling out venues across America. Now, they weren't big venues, probably no more than 1,000 seaters, if that, but they were sold out. And while Keith felt musically vindicated by this, I don't want to give you the wrong impression. Mick Jagger was a giant pain in the ass that wanted to pull the band in some very odd directions. However, Keith Richards was also a nightmare. He was a full-on air heroin addict for the better part of a decade that could not be relied upon to do anything, like show up places. He also has a propensity for whiskey and guns and showing you both. So they're both very much to blame at this point. In 1989, the Rolling Stones learned that they were being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Coincidentally, or because of this fact, Ronnie Wood orchestrated a meeting between the two men in Barbados to try to patch things up. Things began poorly. Keith and Mick began screaming, calling each other every name they could think of for about an hour straight. However, just past that hour point, one of them said something so ridiculous, the other started to laugh, which made the other one laugh. And without really apologizing or acknowledging it, they both realized they had done some pretty fucked up stuff, and they were kind of ready to just move forward. At the induction ceremony, everyone had nice words, but it was Mick's direct mention of Keith that solidified the new alliance. In his remarks to the crowd, Mick said, quote, "I'm very proud to have worked with this group of musicians for 25 years. The other thing I'm very proud of is the songs Keith and I have written," end quote. And though poorly stated, the message was clear. The Stones weren't going anywhere. Following the induction, Keith and Mick sat down and sketched out an alleged 50 songs for the band to record. The result was the Stones' 19th or 21st album, again, depending on how you count, Steel Wheels, and people went absolutely apeshit. This thing sold 2 million copies, and I just want to say, it's fine. It's not great. It's fine. I saw one quote that said, "It's not a very good Rolling Stones album, but it's fine for a band that isn't the Rolling Stones." And that's a good summation. It's not a bad album. It's just not a good Rolling Stones album. Following the release, the band set out on the largest tour to date. They hadn't been on tour since 1982, and people were dying to see the Rolling Stones. Granted, they were going to get a lot of Steel Wheels material, but they also got the hits too. Now, by this point, Mick and Keith began to realize their relationship had permanently changed. They didn't have to be best friends or brothers, or certainly not the Glimmer twins, whatever that means. And yes, I actually do know where it came from. Google it if you're interested. But they needed to be able to work together. And so that's what they did. The 90s saw two Stones albums and corresponding tours, and by this point, of course, each band member had their own dressing room and they would meet in the wings before taking the stage. Defying all the odds, Keith, Mick, and the Rolling Stones all made it to the 2000s. Not content to retire to a giant island for some reason, the Stones became an almost non-stop money-making tour machine. Now, it wasn't all smooth sailing from this point either. Mick and Keith could be around each other long enough to make music, but they still sort of rubbed each other the wrong way, which is a very cute way of saying they kind of hate each other. Although I suspect Keith likes Mick a lot more than Mick likes Keith. For instance, there was the incident in 2003 when Mick accepted a knighthood from the British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Keith thought it was completely selling out, and he wasn't totally wrong. Blair was using Jagger as a political tool to whitewash some unpopular thing at the time. I can't imagine what that was in 2003, but I also can't blame anyone for wanting to be knighted. I want to be knighted. If you can knight me, please reach out, hatepodmail@gmail.com. I want to be knighted. Are you in a much smaller country? I will be a knight of your country, hatepodmail@gmail.com. Make the subject Sir Garrett. Another dust-up came in 2018 when Keith heard that Mick was having a child. When asked for comment by the press, Keith, not thinking, said, quote, "Oh, those poor children," end quote, before suggesting that Mick get a vasectomy immediately. Something I completely agree with, but it did in fact require a face-to-face apology before Mick would go back out on tour. Even as members die, these two men continue going out there night after night to do something they can only do together. Since the turn of the century, the Rolling Stones have been on tour 15 of the last 23 years, and it would have been even more had the world not shut down briefly in 2020 and 2021. And these guys aren't just sitting on stools. Well, Keith is for part of the time, but Mick's still moving and sounds really good. If you do catch a show and you watch them on stage, they look like old friends. They horse around, they exchange smiles, but this is, as Keith puts it, a gentleman's agreement. It's the only way they know how to communicate effectively any longer is through the music. And while it might be a great time and they all revel in getting to be the Rolling Stones, when the show is over, they join arms arms, they bow, and then wordlessly they leave to get in their own cars, to go to their own planes, and go to the next stop and do it all over again. Because at the end of the day, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger know that they can only be the Rolling Stones with the other. And so they've overcome drug addiction, ego, fame, money, women, things that have brought down arguably better bands than this one, because they know that they need the other one in order to do this one thing they love, and that's playing music. Okie doke, folks, that's going to do it for this week. Thanks so much. Hope you enjoyed it. I learned a lot. Hope you did too. We'll be back next week with a regularly scheduled prep-episode. Tim will be here. Like I said, I believe we're doing Flagpole Sitta. Clearly haven't done my homework yet, so get excited. As always, you can reach out to us, hatepodmail@gmail.com, hatepod.com. Click on Contact Us in the upper left-hand corner if that's your jam. You can reach us on Instagram. That's hatepod. Threads is hatepod. Twitter's album hatepod, though not a lot going on out there these days. We got subreddits, we got Discord servers. Reach out to us. We want to hear from you. What do you like, dislike, thoughts, ideas, recommendations, artwork, songs, interstitials, bumpers, you name it, we want it. But that's going to do it for this week. For Why I Hate This Album, I have been one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey.
There's cowboys running through my dreams. Nothing's quite the way it seems. I joined the Navy, got kicked out in a week. My facial features aren't distinct. Try to find some meaning in these songs. The genius is a genius, got it wrong. No, it's a lobster murder sex thing. It's the bleaching of the rear. A full assault on both your ears. The riffs are too repetitive. The lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides. The cover art's a mess. Listen to it for a week. Now that week has passed. It's the Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Gary.